On this channel, we recently covered the synthetic drug fentanyl, including its lethal potency and the disturbing effects it has upon its users. Unfortunately, fentanyl has started to be a dominant substance amid drug abuse in many parts of the world, continuing to bring widespread misery with it. In the Netflix series $10 Death Trap, filmmaker Dominic Streeter spoke candidly to people familiar with the effects of the drug and described how, quote, while lucrative, illicit street fentanyl is often being cooked by amateur gangsters in their basements. They're making the recipe up as they go along, and the final product is synthetic and wildly inconsistent. Some places, such as the Vancouver neighborhood in which Streeter filmed his documentary, are now racked by use of the opioid. But their threat has become even more compounded by various fentanyl derivatives adopted even by long-term users of other opioids. These are collectively known as fentanyl analogues, and they are lethal. As the name would suggest, fentanyl analogues are derived from fentanyl itself, for which reason it's been referred to as their precursor drug. Just as a reminder, let's quickly take you through exactly what fentanyl is and why it's seen as so destructive to drug-using communities in the US and elsewhere. Well, fentanyl was developed in Belgium in the 1950s. It was introduced as a powerful analgesic or painkiller, which was remarkably fat-soluble. This meant that its effects would be felt much swifter than other opioid painkillers. Morphine, in contrast, is hydrophilic or water-dissolvable, meaning it has a fairly low fat solubility and therefore a slower onset time. Fentanyl can enter the brain much quicker, with maximal effect obtained in 5 minutes and only 1 to 2 minutes if injected intravenously. But aside from being fast-acting, fentanyl is also incredibly strong. It is more than 100 times more potent than morphine and around 30 times more potent than heroin. Of course, negative side effects were visible from the beginning, and the FDA initially opposed the drug based on concerns of Dr. Robert Dripps, professor of anesthesiology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dripps, rather prophetically, feared it would lead to severe respiratory arrest in users and strong risk of abuse. But after a compromise with fentanyl's developer, Dr. Paul Janssen, Dripps relented and the opioid was approved. Fentanyl entered circulation in the United States in 1968. So, by the early 2010s, opioid overdoses were known to kill around 60,000 Americans a year. Fentanyl was central to this morbid figure. It started life as intended, a medically overseen analgesic issued to treat chronic pain. But over time, it became more and more readily available in a wide range of forms, including lozenges, patches, and lollipops. Soon enough, it came into illicit use on the street. Fentanyl is so potent that residuals from used patches have been suspected of contaminating water in places where the drug was flushed down the toilet. According to the Pacific Northwest National Library, used patches have also been known to stick to children or animals, causing unintentional overdoses. Given its devastating effects, eventually the US began to crack down upon fentanyl. In 2017, President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 13784, which established a commission on combating drug addiction and the opioid crisis. Health authorities across the world also began scheduling the drug. However, it cannot really be said that efforts by authorities to curtail the drug have been successful. Fentanyl deaths in the US doubled during the COVID-19 pandemic, increasing from around 36,000 in 2019 to close to 75,000 in 2022. It is reported that all illegal drug-related deaths in the same year stood at 111,000. This would make fentanyl responsible for roughly 2 in 3 drug overdose deaths. According to the CDC, the number of deaths by fentanyl overdose seemed to show a sharp drop in 2024. However, some variables may muddy this figure. For one thing, autopsies are not always performed in the wake of suspected overdoses, especially in the case of steep saturation of such deaths, such as during an outbreak. This would leave the cause of death suspected and potentially misattributed to a different substance. But perhaps above all, the figures may be muddied by the new variations of fentanyl which have appeared on the horizon. These offshoots are a kind of loophole for producers and users, since many are not officially classed as fentanyl. This means that they cannot always be subject to the same legal regulation, drug grades, toxicology tests, or even to be counted under opioid death statistics. And these are, of course, our fentanyl analogues. Analog is defined simply as something comparable to something else. Fentanyl analogues, or simply fentalogues, are chemically or pharmacologically related to fentanyl but sufficiently different as to be legally classified otherwise. Troublingly, the analogues are, with time, matching fentanyl in use, and some are emerging as even more deadly still than their parent substance. As described by the US Sentencing Commission, significantly more fentanyl analog offenses resulted in a user's death at 29% compared to fentanyl overdoses at 14%. Fentanyls are so deadly that they have even been used in international assassination missions. I actually have another channel called Warfronts, and we made a video about Israel's president, Benjamin Netanyahu, and we talked about a failed assassination that he ordered early in his first term on then Hamas leader Khaled Mashal. Mashal was doused with an obscure nerve agent by Israeli operatives as he left his office in Jordan in September 1997. But the assassination failed, and an international political crisis was only avoided when Israel provided an antidote. It's now commonly accepted that the agent used, which left Mashal in a coma, was a fentanyl analog. Fentanyl analogues are often not terribly difficult to produce even. In fact, many of them are created simply by modifying fentanyl's basic chemical structure or by cutting the fentanyl compounds with additional elements, perhaps other opioids or synthetic drugs. Now, all of this has led to a massive proliferation of these substances, which can be hazardous for drug enforcement authorities to try and keep up with. Wikipedia has a list of dozens upon dozens of fentanylogs, although naturally not all of these are street-used. If and when a given analog has been identified, it can be listed as a controlled substance by drug enforcement authorities and banned, a process known as scheduling. Authorities in the US do have some power to sweepingly target fentanyl analogs under the Federal Analog Act of 1986, which allows a substance deemed substantially similar to a controlled substance to be scheduled as if it were that substance itself. However, producers have attempted, sometimes with success, to circumnavigate this with the creation of analogs with similar effects while hurdling existing legal frameworks and detection in lab tests. Drugs of this kind, these are called designer drugs. Many fentanyl analogs have now gained notoriety and have sparked deadly crises in their own right. And what makes these drugs so difficult to contain is, in part, the wide variation in their effects and their potency. Here's a couple of examples. Fentanyl is a veterinary analgesic considered the most potent known opioid in the world. An odorless, white powder, it is approximately 10,000 times stronger than morphine and up to 100 times more potent than fentanyl itself. Carfentanil was first synthesized by Paul Janssen in 1974 and was introduced as a tranquilizer to restrain animals as large as elephants. Understandably, it was never intended for human use. But it came to be adopted for illicit use anyway, and is known to be mixed with heroin by some users, or even taken inadvertently by users believing that they're taking heroin alone. Due to the rise in dependency on this new analog, over time, it came to the attention of the World Health Organization, or WHO, who in 2017 endorsed a recommendation from the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, or ECDD, to impose strict controls on carfentanil. It was given the most stringent level of international control, Schedules 1 and 4 of the 1961 UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. And with good reason. Carfentanil can lead to chilling results, especially among inexperienced or first-time users. In 2024, Alpais described how cocaine laced with carfentanil was responsible for the sudden death of 24 people in the Argentinian capital of Buenos Aires. Hundreds of people had taken the laced cocaine, many of whom succumbed to its toxicity in a single day. Aside from powder, carfentanil exists in tablet and spray form and is believed to be largely concocted in drug labs in China. In a 2012 edition of the journal International Toxicology, it was even revealed that carfentanil was one of the primary compounds in the mysterious nerve agent used by Russian security services in the catastrophic Moscow theater hostage crisis. The crisis took place in 2002. 40 Chechen separatists took more than 900 people hostage in Moscow's Dubrovka theater. The decision was made to release an aerosol into the building, details of which were strictly hidden by Russian authorities. Given the Mashal experience, this worked out about as well as one might expect. The substance fatally poisoned most of the Chechen terrorists, but also resulted in the deaths of more than 130 hostages. The Russian government vaguely declared that the deaths were the result of terrorist activity. But it was revealed by the chairman of the health committee of the city of Moscow only days after the event that of the 117 hostages who died so far, only one showed gunshot wounds. More than 600 former hostages were hospitalized, and many suffered permanent disabilities. But while perhaps the most potent of all the officially classified fentanyl analogs, carfentanil wasn't the only one targeted by the ECDD measure. The same recommendation also included the designer drug fentanyl. Fentanyl, in some ways, lies on another end of the potency spectrum of analogs. It is thought, unlike the supercharged carfentanil, to only have about 1/5 the potency of fentanyl itself. Fentanyl is one of the branch of fentanylogs given the nickname China White for the perceived purity of the substance. With that said, Fentanyl is usually not pure at all, and its comparative mildness doesn't mean it's also not extremely toxic. It is up to 50 times stronger than heroin, and in the mid-2010s, it was linked to a string of overdoses in parts of the US. Around that time, the Drug Enforcement Agency of the US added fentanyl to its list of controlled substances. It was also added to the WHO's list of controlled substances in 2017, and control measures were enacted by the Council of the European Union that same year. But therein lies an indication of the difficulty that comes in oversight of these analogues. Even when a new strain of an existing version of fentanyl is identified and banned, it doesn't take long before a new strain is cooked up and sold on the illicit market. So in spite of the DEA ban, only 1 year later, new derivatives of fentanyl were to be found wreaking havoc in New York City. Rolling Stone described how a variant of the drug was being cut with lemon juice or even dry human feces, leading to a host of new accompanying conditions such as fungal sepsis. This made treatment of an overdose, already a difficult task, just that bit more complicated. Aceto Fentol is another fentanyl analog, also found under the umbrella term China White. Also predominantly produced in powder form, its potency, like for fentanyl, is relatively milder than fentanyl pure and much milder than carfentanil. But it is several times stronger than heroin and at least 15 times more potent than morphine. It is often taken by users undergoing a vicious withdrawal from heroin or oxycodone. Aceto Fentol emerged in the 1980s and was scheduled by the ECDD in 2016, 1 year earlier than the previous two fentanyls we've discussed. Unfortunately, as described by the journal Live Science, because of its rather opaque nature, first responders have difficulty in resuscitating individuals who overdosed on analogues such as Aceto Fentol. Because of its close resemblance to powdered versions of other drugs, because it is routinely cut using those other drugs, and because some users have no idea what they took was a fentanyl at all, administering the correct medicine is tricky. Typically, first responders in the US administer naloxone, often referred to by its brand name of Narcan, to people suspected of a heroin overdose. But someone who's overdosed on a fentanyl analog will have taken a far more potent dose than heroin, even if they exhibit the same symptoms. Such a scenario would require a far stronger dose of naloxone. But to know this, a first responder would need some kind of toxicology test, practically impossible in such circumstances, with every second counting. Unfortunately, this is made worse in the case of analogues such as Aceto Fentol, as little is known about the chemical content of the drug. What is known, anecdotally, is that it causes particularly acute respiratory depression. It requires unusually high doses of naloxone to remedy, even when compared with fentanyl pure. But its obscure properties present also a legal challenge. Aceto Fentol is considered illicit for human consumption, but is not regulated if labeled as not for human consumption. According to researcher John Stogner of the University of North Carolina, this allows legal loopholes that drug distributors can exploit by mixing a highly regulated drug like heroin with a less regulated one like Aceto Fentol. The analog has been linked to a number of prominent deaths in recent years. In 2017, rock musician Tom Petty was found to have died of a lethal overdose of Aceto Fentol combined with other opioids and benzodiazepines. Several deaths have also occurred in US prisons. Being a synthetic drug, fentanyl and its analogues cannot be grown and cannot be produced by users or distributors by themselves. It can be cut by criminal gangs using other substances, but some lab knowledge is necessary to produce the original opioid. For this reason, most of the fentanyl bought and consumed in the United States and Europe is created elsewhere and illicitly trafficked inward. As the name China White would suggest, a country long associated with the trade of illicit fentanyl and fentanyl analogues is China. According to the US Sentencing Commission, fentanyl analogues were, quote, likely to be purchased directly over the internet or dark web, frequently from China, and shipped by international mail or express package services. And the US is not the only country affected. In 2017, the Associated Press reported that it had identified 12 Chinese companies willing to export carfentanil to the UK for as little as $2,750 per kilogram. That same report stated that the drug was so potent that even to simply touch it could pose a danger to an individual. Of course, it's very difficult to say how serious China is treating the problem. The Chinese government has claimed it's doing what it can, while simultaneously warning the US to get off its back. However, in order to contain the fentanyl epidemic, it has been a key objective of the US and other countries to continue pressure on China to clamp down on the production and sale of fentanyl analogues. And when they succeed in doing so, as if by magic, the presence of the substance in the US seems to drop. In 2015, Aceto Fentol was added to China's list of restricted substances. 6 months later, the Associated Press reported the monthly seizures of the analog in the US had plummeted by 60%. In 2019, China announced that it had scheduled all forms of fentanyl, the only major country in the world to do so. Despite this, it is thought that the flow continues through a diverse range of avenues. As described by the Drug Enforcement Agency in an international fact book, the Chinese flow of fentanyl is carried out by direct mail-in shipping, which includes not only fentanyl powder, but also tools such as pill presses, stamps, and dyes for further production elsewhere. Such products may be sent directly to the US, disguised as gadgets and other low-cost merchandise, and sometimes they sail through customs with ease. But another common route is through neighboring countries. Drug production and exporters in China are believed to send precursor products to locations in Mexico, where they can be turned into fentanyl by drug cartels and sent onwards to the US. Yet another common avenue of Chinese-originating fentanyl is Canada, with smuggled precursors arriving in Pacific ports for further circulation elsewhere. Small wonder, then, that among the locations racked by fentanyl use, as described in $10 Death Trap, are districts of the Canadian port city of Vancouver. As a curious anecdote, Dr. Paul Janssen, the man who created fentanyl and lobbied for its introduction to the US market, is a revered figure in his native Belgium. He was voted as the second greatest Belgium of all time in 2005, finishing behind St. Damien of Molokai and one place ahead of legendary cyclist Eddy Merckx. In the years since then, the fentanyl epidemic has truly exploded. According to Reuters, more than 400,000 Americans are believed to have died of synthetic opioid overdoses in the past decade. This has included several high-profile deaths directly tied to fentanyl and its derivatives. Tragic, recent examples include actor Angus Cloud and the musicians Prince and the aforementioned Tom Petty. Moreover, news website Salon estimates that around 1 million people in the US had died of fentanyl overdoses since 2000. In Europe, the problem was largely curtailed by a greater presence of heroin, ironically considered a lesser evil than fentanyl and fentanyl analogues. However, fears have risen that with the Taliban curtailing heroin poppy production in Afghanistan, heroin in Europe will be replaced by even more destructive opioids. Unfortunately, the presence of these fentanyl analogues does not show signs of abating for now. Rates of use remain high, contributing to the wide variety of analogues which have appeared. Part of the reason that containment remains so difficult is because the US and other countries wherein fentanyl analogues have become a concern are dependent on the cooperation of manufacturing countries. China has done so to an extent, such as when it scheduled known fentanyl analogues in 2019. However, as revealed by NPR and other news sites, procurement of illicit substances from labs in China remains relatively easy. It was revealed that at least 31 vendors were found on Alibaba selling 4 fentanyl precursors in 2019, more than 3 months after the Chinese fentanyl class ban went into effect. NPR spoke to one man who they described as among 100 vendors who marketed fentanyl or related chemicals out of facilities in China. For some, the Chinese response has simply not been enough. The role of China in the fentanyl question remains a pressing topic in American political discourse, and President-elect Donald Trump appeared to take a tough stance on the topic in November 2024. In a post to his Truth Social channel, he stated that he would place an additional 10% tariff on goods from China, as well as 25% duties on merchandise from Mexico and Canada, who he claimed had not taken strong enough action to prevent illicit substances from flowing into the US. Time will tell if this will make a difference, or if the opioid epidemic will continue its runaway course.